Picture the pitch. 20 cars screaming down your city's streets at 200 miles an hour, broadcast to hundreds of millions of people in over 180 countries. Billionaires and movie stars in your grandstands. Your skyline, your bridges, your waterfront, on television screens from London to Tokyo to Sao Paulo, for one glorious weekend a year. Every mayor who's ever chased a Formula One contract has stood in front of a camera and said some version of the same sentence. This will put us on the map. Here's the problem. Putting yourself on the map costs somewhere between $40 and $55 million a year, in cash, before a single ticket is sold, before a single hotel room fills up, and before you've built a track capable of holding the race in the first place. And that number goes up every single year, by contract, whether your race sells out or not. South Korea found this out the hard way. They built a 5.6-kilometer circuit in the middle of rice paddies, hosted Formula One for exactly 4 seasons, and walked away having lost the equivalent of more than $160 million. Today, that track sits half swallowed by weeds, a roughly $500 million monument to a bet that didn't pay off. So the real question isn't whether Formula One makes for a great television spectacle. Obviously it does. The real question is this. Once you've signed the contract, where does all that money actually go? And for the cities that do it right, how do they ever get it back? Let's start with the reframe you need to make before any of the numbers make sense. Hosting a Formula One race is not really a sporting event. It is a leasing arrangement, where a city or a country rents 3 days of global television time from a company that owns the exclusive rights to that attention, and Formula One charges accordingly. The racing itself, the cars, the drivers, the trophies, that part is basically free content the host city gets to stand next to. What you're actually buying is the broadcast. So let's talk about what that lease actually costs. Formula One doesn't publish these contracts, so every figure here is an industry estimate, but the range those estimates land on is enormous, and it tells you almost everything about how this business works. At the low end, historic European races like Silverstone in Britain are estimated to pay somewhere around $26 million a year, a legacy discount for decades of history with the sport. Monaco, the most famous race on the calendar, paid essentially nothing for decades, trading on pure prestige, though its new deal moving forward is reportedly closer to $25 to $30 million. At the other end of the spectrum, newer markets pay a steep premium to buy their way onto the calendar. Qatar's 10-year deal is estimated at around $55 million a year, believed to be the most expensive hosting fee on the schedule. Across the calendar, race promotion has become roughly a billion-dollar annual revenue stream for Formula One, although that category includes more than just the hosting fees paid by outside promoters. And that's before Formula One has sold a single ticket, sponsorship, or broadcast package on top of it. Now, let's talk about the door you have to walk through before you can even discuss a hosting fee, because for most cities, this is the bigger number by far. You need a circuit, and Formula One doesn't accept just any racetrack. It has to be certified to the sport's highest safety standard, FIA Grade 1, which means enormous runoff zones, barrier systems engineered to absorb a serious high-speed impact, and garages, medical centers, and broadcast infrastructure built to a global television spec. Building one of these from scratch is typically estimated at somewhere between $250 and $500 million. Abu Dhabi's Yas Marina circuit, built on an artificial island with a marina running straight through the paddock, is the extreme outlier, reportedly costing around $1.3 billion. Even a street circuit, which uses public roads instead of a permanent track, isn't cheap. Madrid's new circuit around its exhibition center, opening in 2026, is reported at roughly $90 million in construction costs, covering the barriers, grandstands, and paddock infrastructure needed to temporarily turn city streets into a Grade 1 racetrack for one weekend and then take it all apart again. And that $90 million figure for a street circuit is really just the visible cost. Turning working city streets into a Formula One track means resurfacing entire stretches of road to a smoothness the cars can survive at full speed, because a pothole that a normal car shrugs off can destroy an F1 suspension in an instant. It means relocating manhole covers, streetlights, and traffic signals that would otherwise become projectiles. It means temporary runoff barriers bolted into pavement that has to be perfectly restored afterward, because it's still someone's commute on Monday morning. Singapore, one of the most famous street circuits on the calendar, has to rebuild sections of its track infrastructure every single year for a race that happens once, and then hand the roads back to ordinary traffic within days. A permanent circuit avoids rebuilding the track itself every season, but it comes with the opposite problem. A very expensive facility that, unlike a city street, generates essentially no other economic value most weeks of the year unless the promoter can fill that calendar with other racing series, concerts, or corporate events. Either path, temporary or permanent, is an enormous, largely one-directional bet made years before a single car turns a wheel. There's also a decision baked into this stage that most host cities don't fully appreciate until it's too late, whether to build a street circuit through an existing already famous city, or a purpose-built circuit in a location chosen for land and logistics rather than glamour. Monaco and Las Vegas both use city streets precisely because the backdrop, the Mediterranean harbor, the neon strip, is itself part of what's being sold to a global broadcast audience. Yeongam, by contrast, was a purpose-built circuit in a region chosen because the land was available and cheap, not because anyone particularly wanted to fly there. That single decision, made at the very start of the process, quietly determines almost everything that happens financially over the following decade. Here's where the whole picture gets heavier, because the hosting fee and the circuit are only the entry price. Once you're actually running the event, a new wave of costs shows up every single year. Security for a global event with this level of celebrity and media attention runs into the millions on its own. Track maintenance to keep a Grade 1 certification alive, because the FIA doesn't just check the box once, they re-inspect the surface, the barriers, and the runoff zones before every single race. Malaysia's old circuit, for comparison, still costs its government roughly $2 million a year just to maintain FIA Grade 1 status for a race it no longer even hosts, and that's just the certification piece. Add temporary grandstands for a street circuit, road resurfacing, traffic control across an entire city district, and staffing a small army of marshals, medical teams, and hospitality workers for a weekend, and even circuits with permanent infrastructure are widely estimated to be carrying well into the tens of millions of dollars a year in operating costs on top of the hosting fee itself. And unlike a normal business lease, this one comes with an escalator built in from day one. Multi-year Formula One contracts can include automatic annual increases, compounding for the life of the deal. In 2025, Malaysia's sports ministry estimated that reviving a permanent Malaysian Grand Prix would cost roughly $60 to $70 million a year. One of the reasons it had no plans at the time to bring the race back, despite still owning a fully certified Grade 1 circuit sitting mostly unused. Over a typical 3 to 5 year contract, that works out to somewhere between $200 and $350 million in total exposure. So where's the money supposed to come from to cover all of that? On paper, the model looks straightforward. The local promoter, whoever signed the contract with Formula One, gets to keep ticket sales, local sponsorship deals, and hospitality packages sold to corporate boxes. Formula One itself keeps the big money, the global broadcast rights, and the international sponsorship deals with the likes of Rolex and Heineken. The fees that helped Formula One generate nearly $4 billion in revenue in 2025. That means the local promoter is essentially running a 3-day festival business, selling tickets and hospitality suites, trying to cover a fee that was fixed the moment they signed the contract, in a currency and a market that has nothing to do with how many grandstand seats they actually sell. And here's the trap hiding inside that model. Formula One gets paid the hosting fee regardless of what happens at the gate. If ticket sales are soft, if the weather is bad, if a competing event eats into your crowd, that's the promoter's problem, not Formula One's. Even Las Vegas, hosted directly by Formula One itself, with the deepest pockets in the sport behind it, felt this in its second year. The inaugural race in 2023 was credited with an estimated $1.5 billion in economic impact for the city, a figure inflated in part by the one-time construction spending on a permanent 39-acre pit and paddock complex that Formula One bought outright for $240 million. But by 2024, once the construction spending and the novelty had worn off, that economic impact figure fell to under $1 billion. Ticket sales dipped slightly from around 315,000 to 306,000, and Formula One's own leadership publicly admitted the race had missed its internal revenue targets, citing softer corporate hospitality sales as one of the main culprits. It's also worth being honest about how those economic impact numbers get produced in the first place, because they're not neutral. The $934 million figure attached to Las Vegas came from a study commissioned by the race's own organizers and promoted heavily by the local tourism authority, which happens to hold its own sponsorship agreements with Formula One. Local business owners in Las Vegas have publicly disputed the number, pointing out that headline economic impact studies typically count every dollar a visitor spends without subtracting the revenue lost by residents and businesses disrupted by weeks of road closures and construction. That doesn't mean the tourism benefit is fake. It means the number a host city puts in its press release and the number that actually shows up in its tax coffers are frequently two very different figures. And confusing the two is exactly how some cities talk themselves into a contract they can't actually afford. Now, here's where the picture flips, because there is a version of this that genuinely works. And it explains why cities keep lining up for a deal that sounds this brutal on paper. The real money in hosting a Grand Prix was never supposed to come from the racetrack. It comes from everything happening around it. A single race weekend can pull in hundreds of thousands of visitors who don't just buy a ticket, they book hotel rooms for a week, eat at restaurants every night, gamble, shop, and fly in on planes that wouldn't otherwise be full. In Las Vegas, Race Week visitors reportedly spent an average of $2,400 each, not counting the ticket itself, generating tens of millions of dollars in state tax revenue in a single year, a meaningful share of which was earmarked for local schools. Austin's Circuit of the Americas draws somewhere around 430 to 450,000 spectators over a single race weekend, and one widely cited 2023 estimate put the local economic impact at around $900 million. Though other studies conducted in different years have landed anywhere from a few hundred million to well over $1 billion, depending on what's being counted. That's the actual business model. The circuit itself rarely turns a profit as a standalone venue. The hosting fee is the cost of admission to a much larger tourism and hospitality economy that the host city gets to keep almost all of: hotels, restaurants, retail, and tax receipts that have nothing to do with Formula One's own balance sheet. This is also why so many host cities are willing to eat a loss on the race itself as a line item. The same way an airport happily loses money on parking if it means capturing every dollar spent inside the terminal. Singapore has run its Grand Prix at a loss on the ledger for years by some estimates, and yet has renewed its contract repeatedly because the government treats the fee less like a sports expense and more like a marketing and tourism budget line, one that puts the country's skyline in front of a global audience it could never otherwise afford to reach through advertising alone. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are playing an even longer game, using Formula One hosting fees as one small piece of a much larger, multi-decade strategy to rebrand their economies away from oil and toward tourism, sport, and entertainment. For those buyers, the $55 million annual check isn't really being measured against ticket revenue at all. It's being measured against the cost of building an international reputation any other way, and by that yardstick, even a financial loss on the race weekend itself can be considered a rounding error. But that flywheel only spins if the tourists actually show up, and show up in a city people already want to visit, which is exactly why so many races fail. When Formula One sold South Korea on the Yeongam circuit in 2010, the promise was that the racetrack would become the anchor of an entirely new racing city, full of hotels, restaurants, and entertainment built specifically to capture that spending. It sounded exactly like the Austin model, but the surrounding development was never built. The circuit sat nearly 200 miles from Seoul, in a region with almost no existing tourism infrastructure and no built-in motorsport culture to draw a local crowd. International fans and F1 teams themselves struggled to find enough hotel rooms and were reportedly housed in short-stay roadside motels never designed for a global sporting event. Without the hotels, restaurants, and everything else that turns a race weekend into an economic windfall, there was nothing left to offset a hosting fee that had climbed to around $40 million a year. The regional government absorbed the losses directly. After 4 years and losses estimated at over 190 billion South Korean won, they simply stopped paying. Formula One dropped the race from the calendar in 2014, and the circuit that was supposed to put Yeongam on the world map instead became a case study in what happens when you buy the broadcast and forget to build the city around it. That's the entire economics of this sport laid bare in one failed contract. Formula One sells exactly one thing: 3 days of the most valuable eyeballs in global sports, delivered to whoever's willing to pay the fee. What you build around those 3 days determines whether that fee turns into the best marketing investment your city ever made, or into a $500 million circuit slowly disappearing under weeds. Las Vegas and Austin didn't win because their tracks were better engineered than Yeongam's. They won because there was already a city on the other side of the paddock gates, ready and waiting to catch every dollar the race brought in. Yeongam built the track first and hoped the city would follow. It never did. Korea isn't the only cautionary tale either. It's just the most complete one. India hosted Formula One for 3 seasons before dropping off the calendar entirely. Its 2013 race reportedly running at a significant loss amid local tax disputes over whether the event counted as sport or entertainment. Turkey came and went twice, briefly returning only when the pandemic-era calendar needed a late replacement. The pattern repeats. A country signs a multi-year deal chasing the tourism promise. The surrounding hospitality economy never scales to match the fixed, escalating cost of the contract, and within a few years the numbers force an exit. The tracks that survived for decades, Silverstone, Monza, Spa, Monaco, share one trait. They were built into cities and racing cultures that already existed long before Formula One arrived, and kept existing long after any single contract ended. So when the next mayor stands at a podium and promises that Formula One is going to put their city on the map, remember what's actually being purchased. It's not a racetrack. It's a rental fee for one weekend of the world's attention. And whether that weekend pays for itself depends entirely on whether there was already something worth paying attention to once the cameras arrived.